I'm so proud to introduce to you Divya Chander, MD, PhD. She is a physician, a neuroscientist, a futurist, and an entrepreneur who will be presenting today on Can You Read My Mind? The Promise and Perils of AI in Brain Mapping. Divya is a practicing anesthesiologist with specializations in neurosurgery, ENT, and critical care. Dr. Chander is also a data scientist with expertise in neural signal processing and has developed algorithms to automate tracking of states of consciousness. A wonderful speaker, amazing woman. Proud to introduce Dr. Divya Chander to the stage.
Hi, so good afternoon. We are going to be moving from robots now to brains, and we're going to talk about how we can use artificial intelligence in the service of reading the mind. Now, before we start with AI, we actually ought to do a brief review, step back for a moment, to understand how we have been reading minds up to this point. Now, this is a photograph that Santiago Ramon y Cajal took in his own workshop in the early 1930s. And what he did was he would look under microscopes and draw nerve cells. This was the earliest mapping of the brain that was done. And you can see these absolutely stunning pictures that he drew. And those bigger areas are the cell bodies, and they integrate information. But you can see a lot of these bulbous objects that we call dendritic spines that are sticking on the ends of the processes that feed the cell bodies. Those are the original input-output devices. Those are the input-output devices of the brain. We're all using them right now. And in fact, function follows form. The spatial relationship of these spines has everything to do with the way that your brain computes information. Now, today we have much more sophisticated atlases at the single cell level. This is an example of the atlas from the Allen Brain Institute. And we're also creating connections to things like basically the wiring diagrams that go between nerve cells. We call this connectomics. And these are some of the many ways that we have been reading the brain. But if you actually want to read activity in real time, you need to measure function. Now, these are two examples of non-invasive brain reading. What you see on the left is functional MRI, in which people go into magnets and perform certain tasks, and blood flow is measured. And the other is electroencephalography, where we actually put electrodes on the surface of the head, and we measure these very, very small electrical currents. But there are newer things coming online. This is an example of a company called Kernel. They have developed a portable device called Flow, which measures blood flow as well, but in real time, unlike functional magnetic resonance imaging. So with this very brief overview of where brain reading was up to a point, let's talk about AI and how that is helping us. So I went ahead and I asked ChatGPT to tell me what it thought the definition of AI was. And the answers were pretty good. So right now, we are here, artificial narrow intelligence. Chat was very clear, no matter what kind of prompt engineering I used, that that's all that large language model was. It's a very narrow instance. It was nothing like artificial general intelligence, which was very similar to the kind of sort of creative, novel behavior that you just heard about, which would be something that would be amazing to achieve in our robots. And once we get to AGI, we'll then simulating situations and algorithms, and evolutionary algorithms to jump to a superintelligence is a completely different thing. But from here on out, we are still talking about artificial narrow intelligence. And I thought it was really worthwhile. I haven't heard Gordon Moore mentioned quite in this way, but Moore's law is everything. Has anybody heard of Moore's law? Okay, so many of you. This is the original paper, published in 1965. And if you look on the y-axis, that's a log scale, but he was only able to plot the density of transistors on a chip up through 1965, and he made a prediction out to 1975, another 10 years, which seemed like a big deal at the time, that the number of transistors on a chip would double every 2 years. Well, Moore's law has been taken out to the present day, and this is recent data showing an example of compute power that's been required to power artificial intelligence. This data and this figure was actually released by OpenAI. And what you can see is that GPT-4, which is way, way there at the top, requires 700% more compute power than its closest competitors, including DeepMind, and 7,000% more compute power than GPT-3. And that has everything to do with why we are making progress the way we are. And in fact, Moore's law may begin to peter off because of the limits of heat generated by chips, and also the size of transistors. We're getting down to the 2 to 3 nanometer range. So what do we have? Well, potentially optical computing might solve some of our problems. Computing with photons is much faster because they move at the speed of light, and they experience a lot less resistance than electrons do. There is quantum computing, and there's even neuromorphic computing, the idea that we should be modeling our chips to function very much like the brain. And I don't know how many of you realize this, but the brain only uses 20 watts. It's about the amount of power that is required for a dim light bulb. Now, none of these things is mutually exclusive, and there are interesting ways also to get to neuromorphic computing by combining wetware, real nerve cells, and putting them in silico. So this is an example from Cortical Labs, which is a company that comes out of Australia. But let's get to the algorithms now. So the first place that I'm going to tell you about using algorithms like this is in the place that I study things, which is mapping the brain to understand the origins of human consciousness. And one of the ways in which we do this is by comparing what brains that are less conscious look like. So sleeping brains, anesthetized brains, which is why I became an anesthesiologist, and comatose brains. What is similar between them? And so what I do is I put electrodes on my patients as I move them from being awake and aware and then giving them drugs which cause them to lose consciousness. These anesthetic drugs are like a forcing function for these complex neural networks. And then I can watch what their brains do on the way down and what they do when they come back. And there are a number of different types of algorithms we can use. We can use typical frequency-based analysis, signal processing. We can look at things like functional connectivity. We can look at information processing. And we can even look at nonlinear dynamics. And all of these things we have not now just applied to looking at anesthetics. They're being applied to things like psychedelics. And interestingly, we're finding that drugs like LSD, ketamine, psilocybin, DMT actually increase functional connectivity and increase the information calculating capacity of the brain. So it's almost as if they're doing the opposite of what anesthetics do and making the brain appear to be more conscious. Let's take this into the next domain, and that is movement. So much has been done with algorithms decoding the brain in order to enable movement. One of the earliest types of brain-machine interfaces that was used to treat Parkinson's disease is this graphic that you see. It's a deep brain stimulating electrode. The electrode can be placed inside the brain, and it is programmed to release electricity by a pacemaker that sits underneath the collarbone. And that pacemaker can be later, there can be battery changes, it can be reprogrammed. Initially, everything had to be hard-coded up front. And then the patient would report a behavior, and then it would be recoded. But there's an entirely new generation of deep brain stimulating electrodes coming online that use artificial intelligence to generate closed-loop systems where the electrodes themselves are processing this information and understanding what the effect is of stimulation, and then making adjustments to the stimulation paradigm based on this. And it's not just for movement, it's even being used to do things like treat mental health. In fact, you can get signals now from deep inside the brain that a patient is going to experience something like a depressive episode. And you could tell the electrodes this, and the electrodes can deliver a stimulation which can abort a depressive episode. Now, most of what we have seen in the movement space has now moved to these smaller arrays. This is a 96 sharp electrode array. It's about the size of a little baby aspirin, and it sits on the part of the brain called the motor cortex. And it interprets the desire for somebody who is paralyzed, potentially from the neck down, to move. Now, this is an older video, but it's important to show you because this was one of the first patients from the BrainGate Consortium. It's an international consortium. And what you see is a woman who is paralyzed from the neck down using her thoughts to control and drive a robotic arm. So this research has been going on for decades. But notice that she's got a pretty big device that's plastered into her skull. Everybody seems to know about this guy. Elon Musk founded Neuralink in 2016. And he didn't invent the idea, by the way, of invasive brain-machine interfaces. But what he did was he used his money and his influence to do some things very rapidly, like decreasing the amount of power consumption of these devices, decreasing the heat generated, increasing the packing density of the electrodes to improve the signal-to-noise ratio, and also, more generally, making the electrodes more thread-like so that they did less damage to the brain. Now, I don't know how many of you follow Elon Musk or his tweets, but he tweeted last month that they had just gotten approval to run the first in-human clinical trials. So that's a huge advance, given that type of technology. But there are other groups who are doing things like this. This research was just published last month, and this is a person who is paralyzed from the waist down. And what they have done, and this is done in EFPL, in Switzerland, but they have been able to, in Courtaine's lab, place electrodes touching the brain and having the intention to move being sent not to a robotic arm, but to the spinal cord. And the spinal cord of these patients is then stimulated. And these patients then can use their mind to walk again without the assist of a robot. And that's incredibly important because not only are these people able to sort of walk with their own agency, but there is evidence that there is restoration of some of the nerve cell connections out to the muscles. So by using this technology, these patients are actually able to independently regain some of the neurological function that they lost. Now, this has not only been done in the motor system, it's been done in many sensory systems. So this is the visual system. And this is also an older video, but again, it's really important to lay the foundation so you see where artificial intelligence is taking us. This is research from Jack Gallant's lab at Berkeley. And what he did was he took a number of students and put them into an MRI machine, a magnet. And he played a number of videos to them using YouTube. They recorded activity coming from the visual cortex. And then these were reconstructed, and an algorithm was created to decrypt what people were seeing when the researchers were blinded. Now, this took place over 10 years ago. Here is the presented clip on the left and the reconstruction on the right. And for that era, this is incredibly good. Now, just realize that this algorithm is responding to primary statistics in the visual image, things like light and shadow and edges and movement. There are now changes because of generative AI. This is a diffusion model, and this is a very recent publication. And what you can see is the reconstruction, which is the thing that you see in the box in red compared to ground truth, is much, much better than previous attempts to use artificial intelligence to recreate what people were seeing. And part of the reason for this is because these algorithms, and this one as well, can train on text labeling, captions for visual images. So somebody just asked you, how many of you have used these kinds of models, like maybe something like Midjourney? It's exactly this ability to translate text and semantic meaning and translate that into a visual image that has to do with why these algorithms are so successful at decoding the brain. They've also been used in hearing. Earlier this year, Meta published a paper demonstrating that training people on audiobooks and podcasts could be read non-invasively from the brain, and this is really key. Do you really want to crack open someone's skull to do this? And this is another example where people had their brains also trained on things like listening to audiobooks and imagined speech. And by using generative AI and large language models and using the sort of semantic meaning of things, there was higher efficiency of decoding. Why? Because it wasn't necessary to get the exact words. It was the gist of what people were imagining or thinking they had heard that was important to capture. Now, this was just published last month. I don't know how many, maybe 2 months ago now. I don't know how many of you heard this, but this was an example of using artificial intelligence to train on, again, what people were hearing when they listened to music. So you're going to hear the original stimulus, and then I'm going to play for you the reconstruction.
All in all it was just a brick in the wall. All in all it was.
All right, so here's the reconstruction. Yes, I know it sounds like it's coming from underwater, but can you imagine being able to reconstruct that from someone's brain without knowing what they're hearing? It's been happening also in the domain of speech. There are people with vocal cord paralysis, usually due to ALS. This was a patient of mine at Stanford. She was the fastest thought typist in the world using the system I first showed you. The systems began to get more advanced by imagining people who could write, so decoding handwriting. But this was also just published. This was an example, and this came out of UCSF, of not only decoding what somebody wants to say who has vocal cord paralysis, but doing it by actually modeling what the tongue and the lips and the teeth and the vocal cords are doing. It was actually measuring what the motor intention was to create speech. And then it was translated into facial expressions for an avatar, so that people who are paralyzed can use their minds, imagine talking to someone, and drive not only speech, but communicate with an avatar that is programmed to look like them and has their facial expressions. Right? So that brings us to this idea of digital twinning. We don't have much time, but I would encourage you to watch this example. It's a podcast that Peter Diamandis does with his own AI that's been trained on the body of his podcast and his works. And you can sort of listen to him interacting with an AI that actually thinks it's Peter.
Welcome.
He calls it Peterbot. And these things are now being done non-invasively, so you don't have to crack open people's skulls. Cognition is doing it with AR goggles, artificial intelligence, and electroencephalography. And these systems are even being used in therapeutics to decode and classify patients and find biomarkers for treating pain. But they're moving into the consumer space, and this is the place that I want to end with. So this is Galileo, which is a collaboration between OpenBCI, Toby, which is an eye tracking function, and a gaming platform. And what they do is they are measuring all kinds of biometrics coming from the subjects in order to drive basically things, an avatar in a virtual world. When you combine that with other things like myoelectrics, basically being able to, in an amputee, measure the intention to move by measuring muscle activity at the stump, or in some cases, nerve activity at a limb, you can do things. And by the way, Facebook, which turned into Meta, acquired Control Labs to do just this, to basically create ways of mapping gesture control in basically Mark Zuckerberg's metaverse. This didn't go down very well when he first announced it, and this is, by the way, part of the announcement of the change of the name of Facebook to Meta. But we have more problems. So Elon Musk is trying, if anybody's heard of the Pi phone, he's not trying to just connect that to the Tesla car and Starlink. He's trying to connect that to the brain-machine interface. So imagine all of the privacy issues that come up with this. And you know, this is from Minority Report, but the idea that the world around you is reading what you want to purchase, what you want to buy, and serving up targeted ads, Well, last year in Miami, a company called Alfie did just that. They started doing that with tablets. There are surveillance cameras in stores all over the world that are capturing what you want to do, your intention to buy things, your interaction with things. There are devices that can now read the change of color in your face, that can read the CO2 you exhale, and figure out what your excitement or engagement is with something. And we were talking, I heard somebody on stage talking about computing and edge devices. All of those devices you have implemented in your home as part of your smart homes may also be delivering information to places that you don't want it to go. There are numerous Black Mirror episodes on this, one of my favorite things, but there are many of these things that have come to pass. If you type enough keystrokes, about 30 keystrokes, and you're using a consumer neuro-wearable device, a password can be decoded. You can identify someone's brain with 100% accuracy by presenting visual images, 100% accuracy with only a few electrodes. You can compare what you record from a neuro-wearable device to a database that's been trained to look for things like addiction. And now if I'm an employer, or if I'm a healthcare insurance company, I could actually ask the subject to wear this and perhaps deny them care or deny them a job because I am getting a biomarker from their brain that looks like something that's already been databased. And I don't know how many of you know this, but white hackers have already hacked pacemakers, implantables, and demonstrated that they can deliver pulses that could basically kill a person. And then it happened with many insulin pumps. So Medtronic had to issue a recall, and most of these companies now have cybersecurity divisions. The final crazy thought that I want to leave you with is that this scene in The Matrix, I don't know how many of you remember The Matrix, but when Neo gets put in that chair and there's a memory of jiu-jitsu that gets jacked into him, we already know how to do this for simple memories. We can actually take a simple organic memory and move it from one brain to another. We can actually generate de novo memories and sensory experiences that people have never had, and we can actually put them into the brain. So this has ignited another one of my passions, which is to protect people, their biometrics, their data rights around the world, because we can read and write to the brain now. And Chile, for those of you who don't know, was the first country in the world that put a neural bill of rights into their constitution. I also advocate for creating a digital immune system to protect us from unwanted intrusions. And both as myself and with organizations that I advise, like the Extended Reality Safety Initiative, I have been going around the world and talking to different governments. And recently we went to the United Nations to talk about protecting people's neural rights by making neural rights and the right to mental privacy and freedom from mental coercion as a human right. With that, thank you so much for your attention.
God. Give me a hug.